Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on another Quantic Dream game. Now later in the year is the 5-year anniversary of Detroit Become Human, and I already did a video on Heavy Rain, so I guess here we're going to be talking about Beyond Two Souls, which is a game that I don't have the level of nostalgia for that I do with Heavy Rain. Again, I actually didn't play Beyond Two Souls for the first time until around the time that Detroit came out, being around 5 years after it first came out. But I've now played the game multiple times, and it's a game that I really enjoyed the first time around. However, I feel like on every subsequent playthrough of the game, my opinion of the game has continued to decrease. Now, like the other Quantic Dream games, this is an interactive drama, the one that despite coming immediately after Heavy Rain, doesn't really feel like a continuation of that, with many of those concepts being later reused in Detroit Become Human, while this game does feel like they're trying to make it its own distinct thing, and in the very typical David Cage way, it has a lot of interesting ideas, but very few of them are properly executed, and overall my opinion on the game is largely mixed. Now I do feel like as a whole, this is a game that is technically better than Heavy Rain in almost every conceivable way. The writing, despite still being flawed, is definitely an improvement. The acting is a massive improvement, particularly with the casting of Elliot Page and Willem Dafoe as the two leading roles. The story has less blatant plot holes throughout it, though I'm really still a decent chunk of them. But at the end of the day, despite these things, the narrative is still very meh to me. So much to the point where I find a good chunk of this game pretty boring at this point, which again, I've criticized Heavy Rain for a wide range of things, and despite all of its flaws, the one thing I would not say about it is that it is boring. Now, it is laughably bad, but really that's what makes Heavy Rain still an enjoyable game to replay, when this game doesn't even have that. It's just a mediocre story that is competently enough told to where it isn't one that you're just mocking the entire time, but still isn't one that's good enough to fully appreciate it for its quality. It is a largely lackluster experience, but again, not entirely bad. And to run through the reasons why I think that way, we'll be running through the game from beginning to end, like my Heavy Rain video. However, with this game, I do feel like there are a lot more general things to talk about first here. First of which being that, unlike other modern Quantic Dream games, there's only one true playable character here, in Jody Holmes, who is portrayed by Elliot Page, who is a massive step up protagonist-wise from the likes of Ethan Mars and Norman Jayden. An interesting thing about this game is that we do end up seeing multiple points in Jody's life, ranging from her childhood to teenage years to her adulthood, but an interesting choice made for this game is that they decided to tell the story in a non-linear way here, which is a choice I am mostly conflicted with. It's again something that is cool conceptually. I do think it adds to the scale of this narrative, and I do think certain chapters are placed intentionally for specific reveals to be had at certain times, but I do think most of the chapter placements here do feel pretty arbitrary, to where it does make me question, was any of this necessary, outside the fact that the story was just poorly paced if it was told in a more linear way. Now, technically, there is a remix mode on newer versions of the game that allows you to play in mostly chronological order, and that is where you do notice the massive pacing issues in this game, with many of the later chapters being way longer than most of the early chapters. And through that, it makes you recognize how they structured the game here, with them shifting back and forth in time periods, but also shifting between shorter to longer chapters. And through that, it does make the pacing a bit better, but still, many of these longer chapters do still overstay their welcome, and the constant shifting in time periods does feel very jarring, where I do think it really would have worked better here if more of these chapters were clumped together chronologically, instead of being as unfocused as they end up being here. While there are certain aspects of the story from earlier on in Jody's life that are better suited towards the end of the game, I don't think it was necessary to continuously shift in time periods in the way that they do. Also, another issue stemming from this mixed up order is that, having come from Heavy Rain, where characters can die before the end, and through that would have impacts on future chapters, that simply can't happen here, because these chapters are told out of order, meaning that the chapters can't have a major influence on each other, while also making you know that no matter what, Jody's going to survive these sequences, which is something that wasn't necessarily a guarantee in Heavy Rain. And I feel like through that, it takes away something that made these Quantic Dream games special. Now, I should also say that this is actually a more gameplay intensive game than Heavy Rain, largely because of the inclusion of Idan, which narratively is a separate soul linked to Jody since birth, which introduces a second playable character, I guess, where you as Idan have to solve puzzle-like sections, essentially being Jody's weapon in the game that can take down or distract enemies, while also opening up pathways that add some genuine gameplay to this game outside the standard QuickTime events. Though I will say it's also something that I just simply don't like. I don't find the Idan sections particularly interesting, along with the combat and stealth sections as Jody herself being extremely tedious in their own right. It does leave me kind of annoyed with a lot of the more gameplay elements of this game, especially with the fact that there are also more failable encounters in this game in comparison to Heavy Rain. Though again, until the very end of the game, none of them lead to the death of the main character, which in turn makes a lot of these feel unnecessary and also kind of ridiculous that Jody's in all these life or death situations and keeps on getting out of it despite failing. But also through that, it leads to more content that you're not going to see your first time around, and through that, there were a lot of sections of this game that I just really didn't see until later replays, which is annoying, but also through the fact that you can literally accidentally end a chapter before even getting to the halfway point of the chapter's natural runtime, I think further shows you just how little impact these chapters have on each other, to where it essentially makes everything that would have happened after that not even relevant to the story anyway. But with that, let's finally get around to running through the game from beginning to end. Again, I'm going to be running through it in its initial play order, which starts up with the frame narrative here, where we see Jody trying to piece together her memories during the conclusion of the narrative. I'll be honest, I never fully understood when exactly this is taking place, as I feel like this section makes a lot more sense for one specific ending than it does for a certain other one, but either way, just a minor nitpick there. But for some reason, the first memory she decides to revisit ends up being the Broken chapter, still a relatively late chapter chronologically, where here we see Jody being questioned at a police station, during which she gets flashbacks, which are clearly bits of foreshadowing, and really, that feels like the purpose of this chapter, to set up this intrigue for the player on what is going on here, though most of it doesn't get concluded in an interesting way. But here we're also introduced to Nathan, Willem Dafoe's character, who's warning the authorities of Jody's power, but obviously we see them attack her anyway, to which Nathan arrives in the aftermath to find everything destroyed, again setting up how powerful Jody can be, but again, a chapter that really doesn't do much for the plot outside of just setting up that Jody eventually goes on the run. But then we flash back to Jody's childhood with the Experiment chapter, which has a young Jody being tested on by Nathan and Cole, two researchers in the Department of Paranormal Activity that end up acting as parental figures for her. But this chapter shows that she's been experimented on since she was a young child, giving us a tutorial on Aiden'S powers, with us using them to figure out what card a woman in the other room is picking. And also later use Idan to move blocks, though this ends up scaring the woman to where we are given the option to continue to wreak havoc and potentially strangle her. But again, the point of this chapter is again showing how powerful Idan can be and the dangers of Jody's powers. But this ends up being followed by another glorified tutorial section, with this putting Jody and Idan on the field in the embassy, which ends up being Jody's first field assignment for the CIA, which by this point I do feel like all this jumping around between differing points in Jody's life is already becoming pretty jarring. And first showing her running from the CIA, then showing her as a little kid, and then now seeing her part of the CIA, and really these constant shifts in the narrative continue moving forward. But here, Jody and her superior Ryan are at a party with the intention of using Idan to steal confidential information from the Sheik, to which Jody hides in a restroom, and most of the chapter has us playing as Idan, as we have a number of ways to get this information. Again, making these sections feel like a puzzle game, as we have to find a way to open the safe, and the easiest way to do so is by possessing either a guard or the Sheik, which I will say that Aiden'S powers in this game do feel extremely convenient to me, to where he has this massive range of powers, and it's never really explained how he does these things. I mean, things like healing or strangling people. Also, finally, this is the first failable mission in the game as well, to which if you do fail it, it really adds nothing to the story outside of just serving as a tutorial, while also introducing us to the concept of Jody being part of the CIA at one point. And really, again, that is kind of the issue with a lot of these chapters. A lot of these chapters are very episodic, and through that don't add much to the plot outside of just being these set pieces that I feel like David Cage felt like were interesting, and through that wrote them in the story without them having that much impact on the story. But then we get to the party chapter, with us playing as a teenage Jody as she gets dropped off at a birthday party of a daughter of a worker in the lab, essentially just an excuse for her to interact with kids her age. But really, these teenagers are just genuinely terrible to her in a way that makes you feel bad for Jody, but also can come off as very tropey, to where it does just feel ridiculous to me. But here we can have Jody drinking beer or smoking weed in order to fit in. She can dance with one of the guys and have her first kiss, but all this just leads to the birthday girl opening gifts and is insulted by Jody's gift of a poetry book, and decides to bully Jody for this, with everyone, including the boy she kissed earlier, turning on her and locking her in a cupboard, which again is really cruel in a very over-the-top way, though here we are given the choice of getting revenge or just escaping, where obviously the more fun option here is getting revenge, where you can knock out the teenagers and start a fire, which may be a bit too extreme, but really I find this to be a fun episodic chapter, again one that doesn't really do much for the plot itself, though does show you the struggles Jody has growing up and makes her a more sympathetic presence here. But then we get to the first interview, the first time Jody ends up meeting Nathan as a child, the earliest scene so far, and I don't get why this wasn't earlier. I mean, you would think establishing this relationship between Jody and Nathan from its starting point would be one of the first things you would do in the story, and though instead it seemed like they kind of prioritize these more tutorial-based sections first, which again makes sense from a gameplay perspective. I do think from the pure narrative, it definitely feels a bit off. But here we do see Jody hating Idan for all the trouble he causes, but also we find out about Jody calls monsters, which we later call entities, these beings that we end up using Idan to fight off moving forward. Now after this, we do get to the Welcome to the CIA chapter, which is just a massive tutorial on the combat, which I just find this entire chapter really annoying. And again, supposedly these training sessions happened over years, and it's really just this long montage of action sequences with numerous QuickTime events, which has us learning about hand-to-hand combat, which I really don't like in this game, where really all it is them showing an enemy starting their attack in slow motion, and you have to essentially guess which direction Jody needs to move in order to block it and strike back, and again, it's just really annoying. We also get introduced to stealth sections here, which are also typically annoying, though again they add a bit more variety to the gameplay, especially in how you use Idan. Also, Jody ends up getting injured, to which we get a new Idan ability in him being able to heal her wounds again somehow, though again this entire chapter just ends up being a glorified tutorial, to where it just comes off as really tedious. But we do put those skills immediately to use with us getting to the Hunted chapter, which all of a sudden now, Jody is now on the run from the CIA, with the police boarding a train she is riding in, leading to a chase sequence, the first action sequence of some consequence in this game, which leads to Jody jumping off the top of the train, with Idan being used to protect her by creating a force field around her somehow. But again, this ends up leading to another long sequence of QuickTime events, where it can lead to her getting arrested, leading to another Idan puzzle section to help her escape, though either way she gets on a motorcycle and passes a police barricade, through again using Idan as a shield again somehow, but eventually she gets ambushed and hides in a theater, while we get another Idan section of taking down the SWAT members outside, which you can succeed by causing multiple explosions outside, destroying the entire town, though you can also fail this and end up getting arrested again, only for Idan to crash the van, allowing you to escape there, though either way she ends the section by telling the CIA leader to leave her alone or she'll kill everybody, which again none of that happens, but all this just feels ridiculously over the top, and how she's just destroying entire towns now. But also, despite this not being the same events as the Broken chapter, it's literally the same events. So essentially what we're saying is that this happened to her twice. So again, that feels kind of dumb as well. But then we get to the earliest memory on the board, that being My Imaginary Friend, the events that directly lead to Jody and Nathan's first meeting, where we play as Jody as a child on a winter day, and we're able to explore her house and get a range of activities to do, but eventually it leads to us going outside to play in the snow, to which we see some kids and we sneak off to join a snowball fight with them, which eventually leads to Idan getting protective of her, to where he ends up choking a kid, almost killing him, to where Jody's father drags her inside and yells at her, clearly not believing her story about Idan, and sends her to bed. To where here we have Idan listen in on her parents' conversation, learning that these are actually just her foster parents, and that they are now scared of her, calling her a demon, and want to get rid of her. showing that Jody was never accepted even by her family as a child, and never was able to have friends due to the worry of what Idan would do. And we do follow this up with her getting attacked by these so-called monsters, furthering this incentive to get her to meet Nathan. A solid chapter here overall, but one that I do feel like would have been better if it was placed earlier. As its placement here, it does feel like it was just kind of randomly dropped in there. But then we get to the condenser chapter, which ends up being our first true encounter with the entities, with Nathan recruiting a teenage Jody to help close a portal to the infra world, as she is the only one capable of doing so, which ends up being a lengthy section here of navigating through the facility to reach the condenser and shut it down, leading to a bevy of Idan puzzle sections with him needing to activate the elevator. We get a new Idan ability and him being to interact with corpses and see their last living moments, which I guess he can do. We also get a long sequence of walking through a burning room and having to put out the fire. We get an action sequence against a possessed dead body, which is essentially a zombie, which is dumb. But eventually we reach the final room, where we will need to reach a console outside of the control room surrounded by entities, leading to this even more over-the-top action sequence that leads to her closing the portal, though we do get a bit of a fake out here of Idan having gone back with the other entities, only for him to still be there, because obviously. So here we do see Jody telling Nathan that there should never be one of these built ever again, which he clearly doesn't follow through with. But then we get to one of the longest chapters in the game, in that being the homeless chapter, taking place immediately after Hunted, where Jody is still on the run from the CIA, now being homeless in the middle of the winter, and ends up being rescued by Stan, a homeless man that allows her to join his group, where we do end up meeting a new batch of characters. A batch of characters that have no relevance beyond this chapter outside of a minor role in the epilogue, which again makes this and future similarly structured chapters to feel completely unwarranted in their length, and more so feel like, again, these set pieces that David Cage just thought were cool and shoehorned them into the story here. But I do like these characters that we do end up meeting here, even though they do come off as overly generic. I mean, Stan is probably the most prominent of these, coming off as a really likable figure here, teaching Jody about the homeless life, teaching her how to get money for food, which has us begging for money or stealing it, or even taking an offer from a creepy guy that leads to Idan obviously saving her. Or we can play music for money, because I guess that's the thing she can do. But no matter what, Stan ends up being attacked by a group of thugs, to which we can either just leave him, which is pretty funny, or obviously save him, though this fight is obviously failable as well. And really this scene just comes off as a very David Cagey moment of them needing to add more melodrama. But going back to the camp, you are able to bond with the other inhabitants, though Walter and Jimmy just come off as fodder here, though Tuesday is a bit more important, being a pregnant woman who has escaped from an abusive relationship that named herself after the day she left home, which, I mean, okay, I guess. But here we end up showing them Aiden'S powers, being able to check up on Tuesday's baby somehow, and also connecting Stan to his deceased wife, which, again, I guess he can do, though obviously this ability has a larger role in the story moving forward. But eventually the story progresses through Tuesday going into labor, where Jody ends up helping her deliver the baby, which is supposed to be this big dramatic moment, though outside of Jody's potential connection to Zoe, the newborn, which again could factor into the epilogue, this really just doesn't amount to much. Though the chapter does end with this pretty big set piece of the building being set on fire by the thugs that attacked Stan, because why not, I guess. But here we have this big rescue / escape sequence, and again Walter and Jimmy can die here, though I mean really who cares, while Stan and Tuesday can't die because they're somewhat important. But either way, Jody ends up being injured and falls into a coma, really just because they need an excuse for her to be separated from that group, and she ends up waking up much later in the hospital, only for conveniently this to be right at the moment that the CIA catch up to her, which again feels extremely contrived to me. Now I know the game explains this as Idan was the one to wake her up, assumingly because he knew the CIA was coming. But I still find this ridiculous that Idan had this ability to wake her up this entire time and just waited 3 months in order to do so. But either way, we end up escaping, strangely ending this scene at the start of the broken chapter, again the very beginning of the game, which feels like another really arbitrary placement for this chapter here, to where you would have expected them to connect back to the beginning of the game at a more integral point in the story. But of course, with us connecting some storylines together, it obviously means we have to jump back to to a completely irrelevant scene, this being back to Jody's first night with Nathan and Cole, to where we see Jody's parents leaving her behind, and here we have to get her ready for bed, only for the entities to start attacking her, and we get the section of Idan having to wake up Cole, and having to fend off the monsters for himself until Cole and Nathan come to the rescue, showing Aiden's first time fighting against these entities, though really narratively it doesn't serve that much purpose as we already knew he could do this. I feel like this would have been a chapter much better placed before the condenser chapter, as here it just feels kind of out of place. But following this, we do get to the Like Other Girls chapter, one that is probably one of the most variant of the non-combat heavy chapters, with us playing as a teenage Jody as she plans to sneak out so she can be like the other girls, during which her outfit that she's currently wearing is determined by what you did during the party for some reason, being one of the few instances of connective tissue between choices here, though again it really doesn't matter. But again, if you get revenge against the teenagers there, Jody will be in a punk phase here, which is just kind of ridiculous. But here we see Nathan and Cole tell her to not leave the facility, only for Idan to possess Cole, letting her escape, though eventually security stops her on the way out, during which you're given some choices that can greatly affect the ending of this section, where you can get caught here, ending the chapter immediately, with Nathan chastising you afterwards for doing something so dangerous, though if you get to the parking lot, you're given another choice on where to hide Jody, which can again also lead to you getting caught if you pick the wrong thing, so again, really showing you how failable this section is. But if you are able to get out of the facility, you get to go to a bar, which is filled with a lot of sketchy men, as you would expect from a David Cage game, and obviously she ends up getting sexually harassed, and again, this is all extremely disturbing, though again, still in a very David Cagey way, where you still are aware of these scenes being portrayed in the most melodramatic way possible, though obviously Idan ends up protecting her here, which can lead to this very brutal scene of Idan taking control of the bartender and using his gun to kill the others and then himself. And again, this chapter is meant to show you how Jody can't be like the other girls, as instances like this happen when she does, though I also feel like that's kind of ridiculous considering this clearly should be an outlier, though again this scene does have minor ramifications on a future one, where if you get this far in this chapter, this scene will give her PTSD for future sex scenes, which is again kind of weird that it's only this scene has an impact when we had a very similar scene in the homeless chapter, but again, whatever. Finally, we cut back to Child Jody for the Alone chapter, which ends up being a mostly pointless one, but it ends up showing us the moment where Jody's foster parents tell her that they're leaving her behind, and her dad just comes off as a massive dick here, and we're given the choices Idan to choke him, but again, one that doesn't really have a major impact. But then we get to the longest chapter in the entire game, and that is a chapter that I really hate, and that is the Navajo chapter, being the last chapter chronologically before the end game, and this chapter really feels like a massive waste of time. Now, I know technically it reveals lore about Idan and the infraworld, but it's really told in such a boring way here that I really just don't feel like it adds anything to the experience, to where I just find this entire chapter to be a drag. But this does take place after the Broken chapter, where Jody stumbles upon a farmhouse in the middle of the Navajo region, where we do meet a bunch of new characters, again, most of which are fine, but again, not playing a role beyond this chapter. Now, Paul plays a similar role to how Stan was handled in Homeless, with him being a likable figure here that agrees to take Jody in. We also meet his sons in Corey and Jay, with Jay being another potential love interest here, who's just kind of boring, and generically their relationship starts off cold, only for it to grow over the course of the chapter. We also meet their grandmother in Shimasani, who hasn't spoken in years, which feels like a generic trope. Though again, clearly things aren't as it seems, where Jody is told to stay in her room the entire night and ends up being locked up in that room, making it clear that the family is hiding something. But again, most of this chapter is really just the tedium of Paul allowing Jody to stay if she helps out with the farm, and that leads to a lot of boring tasks that through that and also the initial learning of this area's connections to the entities, it really just leads to this being such a slog. But here we do learn that the area is being tormented by an entity that we later help them defeat alongside Idan, though along the way Shimasani and potentially Paul can die through the conflict. And again, really this entire section here, like there's not that much plot to talk about, but despite that, it still takes up over an hour of gameplay here. Again, feeling like a big waste of time, especially considering the actual relevant information happens at the very end, where we bury the dead at a sacred site, leading to Jody finding a cave wall painting about the entities, including one just like Idan, who is attached to a human. And again, it feels like this chapter is added here to add more lore to the game, but really it's like, who cares? Yeah, I just did not find this chapter interesting really at all, especially considering its very episodic nature. But then we get to the final teenage Jody chapter in Separation, which details the day Jody gets recruited for the CIA, to which she is told about this literal moments before it ends up happening. Once again, feeling like a melodramatic moment here, obviously making her feel abandoned by Nathan and Cole here, and we do get this emotional scene of her final visit to her room and picking up mementos along the way, but this is also her first meeting with Ryan, who does come off as a bit of a dick here. And again, this all just feels so unnecessary in how terribly they treat Jody across this chapter for them to just not give her a heads up about this happening, and also Ryan essentially treating her as an object here, though this leads to a very awkward transition as the very next chapter ends up being the dinner, where Jody goes from hating Ryan to wanting to sleep with him, which is again pretty jarring here. I mean, we do see Jody and Ryan having a date in her apartment where Idan can do a number of things to ruin this date, which leads to most of this chapter being a race against time, with Jody trying to get her apartment prepared for the date, where you are given a number of options of things to do in this time, like cleaning up. You can pick what clothes to wear. Of course, you can pick what meal to eat, during which we are given a cookbook with several options, one of those options being Asian beef, which I still don't know what that is. But again, along the way, Idan causes distractions to throw Jody off, including locking her out of her apartment, where here we do find out that Jody also has her own abilities of telekinesis that she can use to open the door, which causes her nose to bleed, which I guess explains why she doesn't use it that often, but again, this really just comes out of nowhere. But eventually Ryan shows up, and you as Idan are given numerous opportunities to ruin this date, and if you do so, Ryan will end up leaving, leading to Jody telling Idan that she hates him, but otherwise the date will go well, though you actually have to sit there and listen to their boring conversation, though eventually Jody will have the choice of kissing him, and if she does, they have sex. So yay. Though again, if in the Like Other Girls chapter Jody did get sexually assaulted, she will end up stopping here due to her PTSD over that, leading to Ryan leaving anyway. But overall, again, I find this to be a pretty fun chapter, one that I do respect the number of ways that you can approach it, though realistically another one that doesn't really matter and does have a pretty awkward placement here. But then we cut back to Child Jody in the Night Sessions chapter, one that is pretty integral to the endgame, which makes me understand why it is late in the story here, but I actually feel like this is one that should have been later. I think it should have been in conjunction with the Haunting chapter that's later on, considering how connected those two are, as this chapter ends up taking place the night of Nathan's family's death, where Jody ends up being shocked by an apparition of two blood-soaked women, only for that to be followed by Nathan getting a phone call, which is where we learn that his wife and daughter have been killed in a car accident. Which, with this and the recognition that Jody knew about this before Nathan did, it obviously sets up Nathan's motivations for down the road. But then we get to the final chapter before the end game, and that being the mission, where we find out why Jody was on the run from the CIA, with this being Jody's final assignment with them, which ends up being a solo mission, which essentially acts as this really big action stealth set piece that I find mostly annoying. But again, considering David Cage's continued hate of the game over screens, despite Jody being able to fail at multiple points throughout this chapter, for some reason she survives all of it. Though the game creates alternate paths for you if you do fail these sections, but here Jody is tasked with killing a warlord, but to do so, we have this long trek in order to reach him, but along the way we end up meeting a boy named Salim, who acts as her sidekick for the back half of the chapter, who is a mostly endearing figure here, and it's cool to see Jody and this little kid seem to get each other despite the fact that they have this language barrier. But eventually we reach the warlord, where we get this Idan puzzle section of possessing one of the guards and getting him to kill every soldier in sight along with the warlord, though afterwards we find out that one of those soldiers was Salim's father, obviously traumatizing Jody there, though again in a typical David Cage way of being way too blatant with its themes there. But after a lengthy escape sequence, Jody is eventually rescued by Ryan, only to find out that the man that she murdered wasn't actually a warlord, but instead a democratically elected president, making her upset why they manipulated her into killing an innocent. But either way, this does lead to Jody jumping off of the helicopter, being done with the CIA, leading to her being on the run from that point forward, which really I don't get why this was saved for so late in the game, especially with this being the last chapter before the more linear endgame, where this revelation of what caused Jody to leave the CIA is something that really doesn't matter to the rest of the story, and feels extremely contrived here anyway. Not even being a cool revelation that recontextualizes the rest of the story, instead it just becomes the most generic plot point that they could have picked here. But again, the rest of the game plays out mostly linearly and brings us to the endgame stretch, starting off with the Old Friends chapter, taking place after the Navajo chapter, where despite her being on the run for a significant amount of time now, she looks perfectly normal here, but whatever. But here she ends up meeting back up with Cole in a park to where they catch up on current events, learning that Nathan has now become the executive director of the DPA and has started working alongside the military, obviously setting up future events there, though here we also learn about Jody's real mother, Nora, who has been living in a psychiatric hospital since Jody's birth, leading us to the Nora chapter, which has Jody breaking into the hospital in order to get answers about herself and Idan, which obviously ends up containing a series of Idan puzzles as we find our way through the building to get to Nora's room, finding her sitting in a chair comatose, finding out that she was actually given drugs to stop her from regaining consciousness, obviously setting up this more sinister background for Jody's backstory, though here we do see Idan link Jody to Nora, allowing them to briefly speak, though I really don't get the point of this conversation, considering Jody and Nora don't know each other. So we're yeah, I know it's a mother talking to her daughter, but considering the lack of connection between the two, it just feels like a scene that was added for more melodrama. Though the scene does conclude with the CIA arriving and knocking her out, taking us to the briefing chapter, where here we do see Jody being handed off to Nathan, seeing their reunion for the first time since she had gone on the run. But here it is revealed that despite Jody having told him to never build another condenser, guess what? He makes an even larger one, starting to show his descent into madness here. But the CIA ends up giving her an offer here of one last mission in exchange for letting her go, which is where we find out about a fictional nation called Kazakhstan, who has supposedly created their own condenser, and Jody needs to help destroying it, as the CIA wants them to be the only ones with this technology for some reason. But this leads us to the Dragon's Hideout chapter, another one of the more annoying chapters in the game for me, but also one I just find kind of boring. Now, here we do get the reunion with Ryan and his other colleagues from the CIA, because I guess they were too lazy to make new characters for her to be with here, but clearly Jody and Ryan have some tension here, and through this chapter, they can redeclare their love for each other, so yay. But the chapter starts with them trekking through a blizzard, to where we end up using Idan quite a bit here. First to find a place to stay, and then later to clear out the loading bay, to where we can take the submarine to the actual base, which is surrounded by a massive condenser. And it is this infiltration section I just find largely annoying. I usually mess it up right away, though either way you do get captured, to where Ryan ends up getting tortured, and if you don't give them any information, they end up cutting Ryan's eye out, to which he spends the rest of the game with an eye patch on, which is extremely funny to me. But here Idan gets separated from Jody due to a containment field meant to keep the other entities away from them, leading to a puzzle section of trying to take down this field, which in turn frees Jody and Ryan, which again, I've always found this section to also be a pretty tedious one, but following this, Jody ends up diving underwater to blow up the condenser, to where afterwards we get a fight sequence with the general, only for him to be killed by the entities, which I guess is a fitting way for him to go, but Ryan ends up saving Jody at the end of it here, which don't know how he's doing this when he should be barely conscious from the fact that he just got his eye taken out. But overall, again, kind of a pointless chapter when you think of it. I mean, despite it being set up as this big final mission for Jody, it's one that really doesn't add much to the plot outside of re-solidifying the Jody-Ryan relationship, though really you can also just turn him down, which makes all that feel pretty pointless. Then we get to the final chapter as Child Jody in Hauntings, where again it is a continuation of what happened in the night session chapter, where here we see Nathan still heartbroken over losing his family, and Jody is awakened by Nathan's late daughter, to where Jody now discovers that she can link the living and the dead, to where she consoles Nathan by linking him to his wife and daughter, which in turn starts his obsession with the infraworld, explaining his downward spiral and why he ends up rebuilding the condenser. And this is one of the few chapter placements I actually do agree with. I do think this was the right spot to have this right before the end, have this big reveal of what Nathan is really doing all this for. Though again, I do wish the previous chapters leading into this were a bit more properly distributed. As concerning the linearity of the previous chapters, having this one going back to Child Jody does feel a bit jarring here. But with that, we're finally getting around to the final proper chapter in the game, in Black Sun, which is an extremely lengthy one, which starts with Ryan once again professing his love for Jody, to which you end up contemplating it with Cole, who at this point does act as the really likable father figure for Jody at this point in the game, where, again, obviously we see Nathan's lunacy throughout this endgame stretch, which does leave Cole as the saner of the two, and the one that is the most supportive to her, and also the one that works alongside her through this endgame. Where immediately afterwards, we do end up talking to Nathan, where he ends up talking about the events of the previous chapter, and the impact it had on him, admitting to doing all this studying in the hopes of bringing his family back. And he ends up showing Jody that he has captured his family's spirits, and forces Jody to let him speak to them again, only for them to actually be in pain and pleading for him to let them die, which he remains in denial that this is the truth, really showing you this dark turn that his character has taken. Though despite this, Jody tries to walk off, only for her to be knocked out by the military once again. Again, a familiar scene, but this ends up giving us a face-to-face with General McGrath, this generically bad military leader guy, who reveals that the CIA was never going to let her go, but they can't kill her either, so they're going to do exactly what they did to her mother in putting her in a permanent coma, which is obviously really messed up. But Nathan then appears, revealing that he is in on this plan, and now also plans on merging the infraworld and the living world, which is just insane. Again, funny to see a character like him, who is presented as this mostly rational figure, up to this point just end up completely losing it in this final chapter. But this is where we do get our final Idan puzzle section of him now having to rescue Jody, to which he is too weakened to break Jody free here, so he has to get the help of Ryan and Cole, which has us interacting with objects on the path to Jody to lead them to her, and this is just a ridiculous section. So you're telling me that Idan is too weak to break Jody free, but is strong enough to float across the entire building and continuously break things along the way to get their attention? So again, that's dumb. And then also we have this section where Cole needs higher level clearance to get through, and somehow Idan is able to modify a database in order to get him that clearance. It's like, how? But also beyond just the how, also, where do you get the energy to do that, considering he's supposedly so weak? But again, just ridiculous scene there. But either way, reuniting with Jody leads to Jody, Cole, and Ryan now heading out to stop Nathan, as he has already deactivated the contamination field, leading to entities already surrounding the entire base. Though here we do get a humorous final interaction with McGrath, where he has now realized that Nathan is insane and wants Jody to stop him, and then orders Ryan to help him escape, to which Ryan defies those orders and punches him instead, which is so over the top. Though a nice bit of development for him there, even though he ends up following that up with wanting to quit the mission. Though either way, McGrath's acting here is also laughably bad, where he's saying we're all going to die in this really over the top manner that kind of makes us feel like a scene from Heavy Rain. But following this, we get a long sequence of action sequences as we make our way to Nathan, and so that we can blow up the condenser in what is clearly being set up as a suicide mission. But Cole ends up being separated from the other two early on and can also potentially die here, which would be a pretty anticlimactic death for him. But only Jody and Ryan end up getting close to the Black Sun, which is where we get another action sequence of fighting off entities, which I will say, I did not know that you can fail this section until my latest replay, where there I was playing it on stream, and maybe I wasn't paying attention, to where I end up accidentally failing this section twice. Something I had never done before. And if you fail this, Jody actually dies, and you just cut to the epilogue, which is just a terrible ending. But if you do get through it, eventually you do meet up with Nathan for your final interaction here, who is even more deranged now after finding out that his plan to bring back his family didn't work. And depending on your choices earlier, Nathan will either kill himself or try to kill Jody, which in that situation, Ryan will sacrifice himself there to take out Nathan. But either way, Nathan dies, to where finally he ends up being reunited with his family, which is portrayed as this happy ending for him. Though it makes you question, like, why didn't he just kill himself earlier if this is really all he wanted? But also, I do hate how his spirit now like tells Jody to destroy the condenser, like trying to redeem his character in a position where it just felt completely unnecessary. But even if Ryan survives that scene, he still ends up sacrificing himself afterwards, where Jody's containment belt conveniently malfunctions so that Ryan has to give his to her, which again just feels like excuse to get Ryan out of the picture as Jody approaches the Black Sun. But it is here where we get the reveal of who Idan is, where it is revealed that Nora had twins and that Idan is her twin who died in the womb, explaining his powers as an entity and his connection to Jody, which, I mean, obviously, I feel like this was the most obvious revelation that could have happened here, but again, it's portrayed as a big moment. But through the Black Sun, I guess her and Idan aren't connected anymore for some reason that isn't fully explained. But this ends up getting us to the final choice in the game, where Jody now has to choose between the two worlds, having to choose between life and death, which is a binary choice here that determines the entire ending, which to me is pretty underwhelming, especially coming from a game from Quantic Dream, which at this point had already made Heavy Rain and later makes Detroit Become Human, these games with a ridiculous number of outcomes, which are decided by varying ways that you play the game, while this game, it literally comes down to one choice. Though I also feel like the choice itself is just kind of dumb, where wouldn't she be able to live out the rest of her life and then later meet those that are dead after she dies, to where she gets to experience both? And really the beyond choice to me is something that's even more ridiculous, where they show like Nora and Shimasani as people that you would go to the beyond for, which is like, who cares about them? But also to me, the beyond choice kind of negates the point of the story as well, where I do feel like the most satisfying outcome here is to let go of Idan and let Jody move on with her life, though I can also see why the other option fits narratively, with the bond between the two being such a core pillar of the narrative. But again, for me, I do feel like letting him go feels right, though to be honest, I don't feel like that's as reflected within the endings of the game, where to me I feel like it satisfies the development for the characters for to go off on her own instead of just relying back on a relationship with Idan, something she had done from the very beginning. But obviously this choice here does determine what epilogue you end up getting. Now if you died even before getting to the choice, it's obviously the worst case scenario, with the world being overtaken by the Infraworld. And Jody ends up talking about how there is nothing left and all she can do is reflect on her failures forever, which is such a depressing outcome. Now the Beyond ending has us revisiting those she cares about in the living world, like Ryan, Cole, and Tuesday, I guess. To which we end up seeing Jody link herself to Zoe, Tuesday's daughter, and prepares her for the return of the entities, essentially making her her successor. Which again, funny, Jody's choice is a character that only appears in one scene previously. That was probably a better ending than I would have expected coming into the choice, as really, despite my qualms I previously stated, I don't feel like those are as reflected in the actual epilogues that we end up getting. Where to me, a lot of the life endings end up being kind of underwhelming in their own right. Where here we see Jody being heartbroken over losing Idan and is given a choice of picking who she wants to spend the rest of her life with. Where you can choose to be alone, you can choose one of her love interests in Ryan or Jay for some reason, or also you can pick spending your life with Zoe for some reason. And again, all these endings are pretty mundane, though through most of them, they do end up having Idan telling her that he's still there, which just kind of minimizes the choice of separating from him to begin with. So again, really just none of these endings are really that ideal to me, but each of these endings do end with a flash forward to the return of the entities, where if Jody is still alive, she'll be there to face off against them, while otherwise it will be Zoe there. Though if you pick the ending of Jody being alive with Zoe, then both of them are there. But really all this feels like a very superfluous ending, kind of minimizing what Jody had just previously done by showing an even greater threat coming later, while also not even showing the resolution to all this either, while also not doing much to set up to this either. So it's like, it really just feels like a pointless scene at the end of the day for me. But there we go. I mean, that's really the entire game of Beyond Two Souls. Again, a game I did like the first time I played it, but on the replay now, I do find most of the experience either boring or just tedious, with it also having a narrative that has a number of contrivances along the way. Now, again, I do think technically it is the best Quantic Dream game up to this point, but again, it is this fact that it is better than Heavy Rain in most aspects that makes it less fun to play. As again, Heavy Rain is a game that you have fun making fun of, while this game you simply don't even have that. So again, I do like the character of Jody Holmes, and like most Quantic Dream games, there is a lot of interesting concepts in this game, but again, the way that they are executed here are either in a pretty dull way or in a very unfocused way that makes this game come off as pretty middling by the end of it. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Beyond Two Souls. Again, I made this video to lead up to the anniversary of Detroit Become Human, so expect a video on that coming up. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.